my apologies, Dr. Joan Vernikos, and our moderator, Marsha Henderson, who's been one of our speaker series speakers before and is now moderating today's session. So just a quick word, if you have any questions or problems just with the volume or any technical problems, share them in the chat function to all, and that will, to me, to Diane Silverman. If you have general questions for Dr. Joan, include them in the chat function to everyone, and then we will ask Dr. Joan during the course of the hour as appropriate. So without any further ado, I'm gonna turn this over to one of our Quorum Advisory Board members, Gray, and she will do the introduction. So thank you all for joining us.
Greetings all. I'm so excited to share two of my favorite people today. Marsha Henderson, who is a member of Quorum, and as Diane said, has been with us before as the person who was interviewed, the interviewee, and now she's the interviewer today. So thank you, Marsha, for that. Dr. Joan is someone that I had the good fortune to meet several years ago. Her husband was my doubles partner at the tennis club, if you can imagine. And he has a wicked slice. I'm sure he still does to this day, but we're both retired from the tennis court right now. Anyhow, I got the opportunity to meet Joan, who is probably one of the most extraordinary women I've ever met, much less people on the planet. She was born in Egypt to Greek parents. Her father went there and took the family because he was an infectious disease doctor. And Joan has led a life of science and intrigue her entire career and life, I would say, Joan. And yes. Her father, she told me recently, her father said to her and her sister, "You're both going to be doctors." And Joan said, "We never thought a thing of it. That's what we both did." And so Joan went to the London School of Medicine and got a PhD, and her sister became an MD, I believe. And so Joan has many brilliant things that she's going to share with you today. Her stories just go on. So to keep it within a 45-minute window, it's not going to be so easy, but Marsha, that's where you come in.
Sorry.
And so we're just going to go. But the thing I want to say to everybody is hang on for Joan's tips on gravity. She was one of the innovators on gravity. So the idea of standing up and sitting down was really in large part from Joan's work. And then I do want to hear about how she got John Glenn back to space when he was, what, 70 or 70 something.
That's right.
Yeah, and he had to get her permission, I think. So imagine.
Yes.
So take it away, Marsha and Dr. Joan. We're so honored to have you here today. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I mean, Marta, you've almost told her entire story. All she has to do now is just kind of fill in the blanks. But certainly, I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Joan, and she is fascinating, and we're all intrigued about your story. So why don't we get started? We want to hear all about your journey. So let's start with, you were born in Egypt, so why don't you take it from there?
I was indeed born in Egypt a long time ago. But I want to emphasize some points that I think might be helpful for women listening to me. Still, you know, it's wonderful to have stories and to tell stories, but what are the messages you get from the stories? And right now, in an environment where COVID is upon us, and it doesn't look like it's going anyplace real soon, I think a lot of people are stressed or feel stressed or have problems, and hopefully you can take away some messages that might help you personally. Not to mention perhaps some examples and principles that can help you in your careers. I was a woman professional at the time when things were a little different, and you're all very lucky to have moved on. And the world has moved on a bit, and hopefully it will move on a little bit more. My father was, as Martha said, he was a physician, he was a doctor, and specialized in infectious diseases, and that's how he ended up in Egypt. Someone said, "My boy, you know, you're studying infectious diseases, the place to go where there's lots of it is Egypt. So off he went to Egypt and settled there, and I was born there. He was 60 when I was born. So he was born in 1875, when there were no MRIs and scans and no lab tests to speak of. And he used to tell the story of how they diagnosed diabetics by putting a bit of urine in a plate and putting it out on the doorstep and watching the flies land or not. And if the flies landed, you were a diabetic, and that was a diagnosis. For those of you who aren't up to date with medicine, you might find this a rather practical way before you go to the doctor to find out if you're a pre-diabetic or a diabetic. There are lots of these stories, but I'm not going to spend time with that. My father, although he was much older than we of course were not aware that he was an old man. He used to raise us up the stairs and things like that. And he assumed, maybe because he was an older father, or maybe that's what was his way, he just assumed we would become professionals. And there was no other way. There was no conversation. We never discussed it. But what do you want to be when you grow up, kind of thing. Not a bit of it. I mean, we knew we were going to do something that was along the professional lines, doctor preferably, because after all, he wanted someone to take on his practice. My sister was 4 years older than I, and she went to medical school. And she became a pediatrician eventually, not because she wanted to be a pediatrician, but because my mother was worried about her examining male patients on her own. And the one option was for my mother to be present, which was not an option as far as my sister was concerned. And the other was to do something else that did not mainly involve patients of all varieties. That doesn't mean she didn't examine patients in the hospital, but that was my mother's worry. And so she went into pediatrics, which ended up being a very good kind of profession. I, on the other hand, went to pre-med the year before medical school, and chickened out from pursuing medicine, because along the way to the auditorium, I had to go through this room with all the dead bodies that stunk of formalin for the dissection of that the medical students used to go through. And that turned me off right there and then. And of course, the family thing is Joan is always the drama queen, and it's not, it's not good enough for her. It's good enough for everybody else, but not. Anyway, I went into pharmacy, which was the second best that was available. And pharmacy was a good alternative, because I learned a lot of things about then available drugs, herbs, techniques of all kinds. We had a professor who had been dean of the medical school in Warsaw, Poland, and had ended up in Egypt, escaping World War II. And he had wonderful stories about syphilis and how you treated syphilis by sitting in a tub of mercury. A bit like the urine and the flies. These are the stories I grew up with. And anyway, so I went into pharmacy. I was, from there, things were not being very pleasant in Egypt. The political environment was getting iffy for foreigners. And my parents decided that I should try and do something where the degree I obtained would be valid elsewhere, not just in Egypt. So I went to London, University of London, and I went to the School of Pharmacy, and I asked them, I wanted to get a master's degree. And they said, well, we can't recognize you. Are you going to go back to Egypt and practice? That was the question. I said, well, no, I don't know what's going to happen. Well, they said, if you're not going to go only back to Egypt, but anywhere else, you need to do a repeat of the last year of the School of Pharmacy to get a bachelor's degree in England, and then from there go to a master's. So I repeated the last year of pharmacy, which was a little different than what I'd had, and started doing some research. I followed one of the professors who I thought was rather inspired, and his research was in stress and hormones, and the hormones that are secreted during the stress response, and how you can measure them and measure the response to stress. And I thought that was fascinating, and so I followed him. He was moving from the School of Pharmacy and going to the Royal Free Hospital School of Medicine, which was the women's medical school at the University of London. The University of London had 10 medical schools, and one of them was for women. All the students were women, except that year that I went was the first year they were taking men. So there were 5 male students in a room full of giggly 18-year-old medical students, because you don't have to do, in England, you don't have to have a bachelor's before you go into medical school. So, and they were having a ball, of course. So that Royal Free Hospital was a fascinating environment. And not only that, but the professor, the chair of the department who came, but also brand new, was a brilliant redhead who came as the new chair of the Department of Pharmacology. And she insisted that we go to a hairdresser once a week, which was news to me. I mean, I'd never been used to going to a hairdresser once a week. And she thought that was very important for women professionals to look good. That was my first kind of introduction. I never thought we had to be different, but there we were. So I started doing research, and the research went so well that about halfway through, the department decided that I could go straight into the PhD without taking a master's degree and apply the research I had done towards the PhD. And that's what happened. And I ended up with a PhD in 1960, a PhD in pharmacology, but actually it was in how the brain regulates the stress response and the hormones that are involved in the response to stress and survival. So that was my research. And in 1960, then I had to make a decision of where to go next. Going back to Egypt was not a great promise. Greece, I had never lived there, and it was not really that far ahead then in research options. And so I applied to Ohio State University and came to Columbus, Ohio. And that's where I taught pharmacology at the medical school and continued my research. 4 years into that, to cut a very long story short, one of the professors, the chair in physiology, was asked by a very nascent NASA to put together a small department or group in biological and biomedical sciences. He selected 5 people. I was one of the 5 because of my stress research expertise. There was a microbiologist, there was an exercise physiologist, there was a biological rhythms person, and the human factors. That was it. That was all NASA had in terms of biological and biomedical sciences at the time. This was 1964. So if you think that the first man in space was around about 1962 in America and 1961 in Russia, it was very early days. We had no idea what would happen to a human in space. And their first missions into space were literally a few minutes being shot up and coming down again. And of course, the premise was that if you take a human and stick them on top of a rocket, it's going to be stressful, hence me. So at that point, there I am in California, about 7 miles from Stanford University, and setting up my research project in a otherwise aeronautical center and NASA getting established there. And there were only two centers at the time, Langley in Virginia and Ames Research Center in California. No Houston, no nothing of that kind. So we started doing research, and incredibly, because we were so naive, the NASA and von Braun, who was the big director of everything at NASA, everything investigative, planned a series of launches with astronauts heading into eventually going to the moon. So here we are. There's a mission for 14 days. Can you imagine? Right there and then we had really no idea except a few minutes and orbiting for one day. And we go for 14 days with two astronauts, Borman and Lovell. And we have the option of doing some research. And the research we could do was to collect urine. They could collect urine over 24-hour periods for the 14 days. And there was one investigator at NIH who had proposed that they would lose bone, they would lose calcium. Whether that was bone or not, it wasn't sure. But certainly lose calcium over that period of time, and the muscles would also weaken. That was about all that was being proposed. And of course, I was measuring in the adrenal hormones that were excreted in the urine and collected and stored. I was using steroid, cortisol, or hydrocortisone in the urine to show that they were stressed. And when the samples returned, they were all tested before, during, and after the astronauts returned from space after 14 days in the same lab at the same time. We didn't know who was who and which sample was taken when. All the samples were analyzed together at a lab. When we put the data together, sure enough, before they launched, apprehensive, I suppose, the steroids were sky high. After they landed, which was going through a great deal of gravity pulling on the spacecraft with a bang to land, they landed, as you remember, in the ocean. Again, a tremendous increase in cortisol. But during the mission, while they were in space, it was essentially precious little cortisol. In other words, it was much, much less than what it normally is when you're going about your business on Earth every day.
And why was that? Why did that happen? Well,
that was the next. I had no idea. People said you didn't do it right. It was incredible, and it was very difficult because we're trying to find why this happened. Did we make a mistake along the way? But again, we had two astronauts, and each one was assayed individually, and the whole time course of 14 days, every day was measured in each of the two, and it was identical. And it was up before and up after, so it wasn't like they weren't responding. And it was a difficult time because I thought, well, here I am. I came here because I'm a stress expert, and this will be the end of a beautiful career. So what do I do next? Well, I was working for NASA, and I started looking at other aspects of space flight and what the astronauts might be exposed to, and looked at, obviously, gravity, since that's the one thing that we, in going into space, you go into reduced gravity, not weightlessness, but reduced gravity. And I started launching a career, really doing a whole series of studies that I did for the rest of my career and the rest of my life, basically, trying to understand the role of gravity and what happens when you live without it and how serious it is. And I will pause here, and then I can go into long tirade of what I did next, or I can do whatever you want.
Well, I want to know what you learned. What are this whole process of going into space and the application for our everyday lives is what I think you've mastered.
Okay.
And you've written extensively about that. And so I really want to hear about stress and what you learned, because you can't be more stressful than strapping, as you told me, a bomb on your back and then letting it explode.
Exactly.
So I think that as we live through our day-to-day things, we hopefully won't quite get there, but we do have levels of stress that, escalate, particularly in a COVID environment. So I would really like to learn what you discovered from your NASA experience.
Absolutely. And the work, of course, I continue doing research on stress on the ground, mostly in rats, but also in humans. And what I will interject here to put you away from your misery of thinking that astronauts, that something was wrong with that first experiment, was 20 years later, I studied some pilots, and they had been test pilots and were now working for Lockheed Martin on a program that was surveying terrain. And an airplane called the U2, what is it called? Anyway, on an airplane that is a single pilot plane, that is a surveillance plane that flies.
Oh, the U2, yes.
The U2.
U2, yes.
Yeah.
I'm old enough to remember, they don't.
Good for you. The U2, yes. And a wonderful plane, little because it's just one, and huge wings. And the wings hold the fuel. And as it flies and it uses up fuel, it's the pilot's job to make sure the fuel is redistributed equally. Otherwise, the plane will dive. So it's a very tricky job for the pilot to do at the same time. He also has a periscope that goes through the floor of the plane that takes photographs of the terrain. And the plane would go for 2 hours, 2.5 hours, 2 hours and 40 minutes, surveillance flights every other day.
And can you just tell them the significance? Because these people are younger than we. This was really an amazing situation.
It was a spy plane, basically.
Yes.
And it got its fame from Gary Powell, who was flying over Moscow and was brought down and captured, obviously. And there's a big court case about Gary Powell, and everybody learned about the U-2 plane. Otherwise, we'd never know that there was spying going on over Russia and places like that. So once in a while they were caught, and when they were caught, it became public knowledge. These planes came to the Ames Research Center in California, where I was, the NASA center, and they used to go up once every other day. Some of the pilots used to talk to me about my previous employer. Well, you can guess what that was. Mostly CIA and that sort of thing. It was very exciting, but great guys. And they would fly up all the time. And I thought, heck, as well, I mean, with the fuel being redistributed and they're having to juggle that and to go up to over 100,000 kilometers, whatever it is, up there, way above the in the atmosphere, and close to where the atmosphere ends. And if that's also stressful, and how interesting it would be to get some samples out of them. Well, I couldn't get anything during the flight, but I certainly could get some urine before and after. And sure enough, it was high-ish before they went. They were a bit apprehensive, but I mean, they used to do that routinely. That was their job. And it wasn't very high when they returned, except one day. And the steroids were sky high when this guy returned. And I said, what happened? And he said, oh, you caught me. I said, what do you mean I caught you? He said, there were crosswinds on landing. So just the crosswinds on landing were enough to get his stress up a little bit more than normally. And I started thinking about the fact that these pilots did this as a job, and they knew what was going to happen, and they were just knew what was, they were in control of the situation, except when they weren't in control of the situation and the stress response shot up. And so I went back and looked again at the astronauts that had gone up on Gemini for 14 days. And I thought to myself, you know what? These guys have seen battle, have seen missions over in Korea, in Vietnam, before they came to be astronauts. This was nothing. This was fun. Going up in space was what they wanted to do. It wasn't stressful at all. It was a joy for them. So depending on how you perceive stress, it determines whether your body responds to it or not.
Mhm. And so with all of this stress and the effect of gravity, you've now written books about this related to aging and fitness.
Well,
So
of
why
course.
don't you share a little bit about that transition that you made from NASA to what we've learned in your books?
Well, I always, stress was always my favorite topic and continues to be, because I don't think we've got all of the answers yet. But what I started saying, well, okay, the stresses we have as young people when we have families or marriages or work are different than what we experience as we get older. And certainly we are different. So not only are what we're exposed to different, we have a job, job is secure, or maybe we lose our job and now we've got the insecurity of a later age trying to find a new job and adapt to it. Or we're exposed to changes in our sleep patterns, changes in our, are we taking care of parents? Are our children in college or getting married or moving on or leaving the house? And are we empty nesters? And there's a whole variety of things that change about midlife. And from then on, both the stresses that you can think of yourself, I'm sure, and your body, and the way you handle stress, the way you perceive stress, are different. Stress is not what happens out there. Stress is what you feel. Okay? And stress, what you feel is, and assess it, and how you perceive it. It's a question of whether it threatens your survival or not. And survival can go from literally survival to a whole lot of things. Losing your job is survival. Having a poor health is survival. Your family makeup is changing, and that changes your way of living. People are depending on you or not depending on you. There's a whole range of situations that change at 50 plus. And we also start worrying about, what am I going to do? Should I get another job, or should I retire? retirement, making decisions.
Well, you know, I've gone through all of those, see, because I left middle age a while ago. So I've gone through every one of those stages. And when we talked last, one of the things that you told me
Mm.
about stress and gravity was something I could actually do because I'm not known for doing a lot of exercise.
Mhm.
And we know that exercise really can be helpful with stress. But you told me something I could really do, and it was stand up. Why did you tell me to just stand up and get out of my chair?
Okay. Part of the research I did, the gravity-related research, was in what we call a simulation model. We don't have enough astronauts up there to do all the research we want to do. So we had to find some way of mimicking the effects of being in space on the ground. So we could do a large number of get data points. And in fact, Germans and Russians had done this, and they decided that if you lie down, when you lie down, and we all lie down, instead of gravity, which is a force that pulls us downward, head through toe, it's just pulling across the chest. So the force of gravity, instead of being maximal when we stand up, becomes very small or reduced considerably when you're lying down, and it's only going across your chest. Okay? So when you lie down, or when you get volunteers, as we did, and study them when they're lying in bed, the effects, the changes we see are very much like those in space. Okay. So that became a model of choice to study what happens to space over a period of time. The changes are immediate. And so you don't need to spend a whole bunch of time lying down to get any changes. You can change, in fact, in almost 2 hours, certainly in 24 hours. And within 24 hours, you become quasi dehydrated. You lose about 10 to 15% of your blood volume. That's why they tell you as you get older and become more sedentary, you need to drink more fluids. You lose muscle, you lose bone, your circulation becomes sluggish, any number of all of these things. You start scratch your head and stop and say, where have I noticed this before? And well, I noticed it in people as they get older, and in myself as I get older. Balance and coordination. When astronauts return from space, they all stand with their feet wide apart because they are unsteady. So the internal organ, the vestibular system in the inner ear, becomes lazy, becomes unstimulated. So the conclusion of many studies and many years I drew was that we need gravity on Earth to stimulate us. It is our constant stimulus. Now, the gravity, unless we do, we are surrounded by gravity. Gravity is pulling us head to toe when we stand up. When we sit down, we reduce the influence of gravity. When we lie down, we reduce it even further.
Well, you told me one of the worst inventions was the chair.
The chair
And
is
that we needed to stand up more, right? And so
yeah.
I've been standing up more
good for
because
you.
I can really do that. I do that really well. I've almost mastered that. But we have a number of questions too that I want to be sure that we entertain. And one of them is from Meg, and it says, "Women in science and space. We are seeing more role models for women and girls. Do you think we need to do more to get girls and young women interested in some of the areas that you've spoken about, particularly, I guess, as it relates to space and aviation and stress?"
Absolutely. There are a lot of women interested. The agency has not been as inclusive. There are an awful lot of women interested. They're coming from all over the place, and they're highly, highly qualified and trained. And in fact, they almost work harder. You know, we number twos try harder kind of thing. And there is one, you know, going up as we speak. But it's the onesies and twosies. The other thing that I noticed, for instance, in doing better studies, is that when we did men, the steroids were elevated during bed rest. And I thought, well, that's strange because, you know, I wouldn't expect it, but every study had always shown increased levels of corticosteroids. And then I did women for the first time in bed, and there was no increase. They loved it. They'd never had such a good time. They were being served. The meals were delivered. Why should they? Why should they be stressed? Why should? Never had it.
Right.
I
I can certainly understand that. I'm sure many women would love to have that.
And then, so I came out to the conclusion: hey, folks, it's not lying in bed that's a stress. It's how you see lying in bed.
Perceive it. You have something in your book that I haven't been able to get to, or certainly on your website. There's a test. There's some kind of free assessment
Yes.
that you can take. Tell us a little bit about that free assessment.
Well, it's a self-assessment on how you see things and what your habits are, and then your chances, your score, basically, of your stress fitness. Well, I call stress fitness. And you can train yourself, because once you know what it is that triggers your stress, then you can work on it. And in the book, there is a stress fitness test, but also on my website, you can go and do self-administer the stress fitness test. And it's very helpful because there are things, not usual things that you don't always think of.
Well, like what?
Well, how many hours you sleep? Do you wake up often? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and worry about something you can do nothing about? But there are things you can do, like when I wake up in the middle of the night and can't go back to sleep, I get up and I do something. I vacuum. You think it's funny, but it's something productive that you can see a result that takes up time in the middle of the day. And if you don't wake up the neighborhood, then it's not a bad thing at all. It's a very satisfying activity. And then I go back to sleep and sleep like a baby. So there are things you can do that are not related to the stress, but relieve the stress, because the stress you have in the middle of the night, when you wake up and worry about it and you can do nothing about it, is not a stress really. It's how you see it as a stress. Now that's important. I had a couple come to one of my talks at Stanford, and the lady was saying, I'm so worried. My grandson is in Afghanistan, and I worry so much about him and what would happen to him, and what woe is me if anything happened to him. And I said, well, what do you do about it? She says, well, there's nothing I can do about it. He's there and I'm here. I said, yes. Does he have a home? Well, no. I mean, he can go and stay with his parents. Well, does he have a fund for college? Well, no, he has loans. I said, yes. And I said, does he have, how about starting a fund for him? How about buying him a home? How about paying off his debts? You will feel better, and he certainly will feel better. And you can take away your stress, and you can go back to sleep. So it's the stress is, 80% of the stresses we experience are self-made. 80%. So if you stop and analyze what's upsetting you at any one time, you remember those buttons that, what was it, Staples or somebody had deleted kind of button? Just visualize you have a delete button here on your chest, a great big delete button. And anytime you feel stressed and you can't do anything, but you can't do anything about it right then and there, just press the delete button. Learn to laugh at it and press the delete button.
I'm going to not only take your self-assessment, I'm going to send it to my daughters. And I'll tell you why. I have adult daughters, and one of the things you just reminded me of, back many years ago when my second child was going to college, it was the days of having a telephone recorder.
Oh, yes.
And I overheard my daughter's older one saying to my younger one, "You're going to love college, because when mommy calls, don't answer. Let it go to the machine and then just hit delete." And so she was telling her how to take care of her stress very early on.
Yeah.
I've got to learn how to reverse that on them so that I can age more healthfully. Okay.
That's right.
So I'm very interested in seeing, the assessment for me, because I kind of know that my daughters are part of my stress level, because I certainly worry about them more than they worry about themselves. So I'm going to get over that. And I'm going to start standing more, because you've told us that sitting is a very unhelpful thing. And you also told me that you don't really have to do anything when you stand.
Yes.
Right?
And
that you can just stand.
And that's the fallacy of the data in the literature. What they look at in all the studies, I think I've never seen anything different. They measure the number of hours you sit. How many hours a day do you sit? Well, it has nothing to do with how many hours a day you sit. It has to do with how many hours you interrupt that sitting. How many times, not hours, how many times you interrupt the sitting. So you have to stand up. You can wave your arms if you want, and then sit down again. What the trick is, what the brain sees is not how many hours you've stood, because that's muscle mostly. But what the brain sees when you stand up is that blood goes to your head in response to that change in posture, and the stimulation of your inner ear, that's balance and coordination. So it is like a cue to your system to stimulate it on regular intervals. And if you exercise once a day, but sit the rest of the time, guess which one wins? The exercise and the fitness, or the sitting? The sitting wins or loses, whichever way you want to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
But so it's interrupting the sitting that is important. Do you know the single best test of aging? I'm not looking at you. I'm looking
Makeup.
at you. What do you think is the first sign of aging?
The way you walk.
The first sign of aging is when you can't get up from the toilet by yourself.
Ooh.
Okay. You can put a bar handle to get on to help you get up. But if you can't get off the toilet, there's trouble ahead. And you may think it's funny.
No, it's real.
But that is the single most sensitive test.
I used to work in public health, and one of the things they always talked about was when women became isolated.
Oh, yeah.
They wouldn't go out because
Yeah.
they would have to be on a toilet and they couldn't get up. And so you have confirmed, because how embarrassing is that? How difficult is that? So they become more isolated, but they become more homebound because they can't get up off the toilet.
It's a vicious circle.
Yes, and it's wonderful to be able to not have to sit on it at all. So to keep those muscles.
Yeah, well, But it's more, yeah, it's muscles. You feel it right away. But the important thing is that your inner ear gets no stimulation. So you lose your balance and your coordination to boot. And you can't stand up when you need to, whether in a hurry or not. Plus, you're getting blood to your brain every time you stand up. And guess what that blood to your brain does? It prevents you from forgetting and all the other nice things that happen when you don't get blood up to your head. It's not just the cells that die, it's that they don't get any blood and any oxygen.
Mm.
What
Well,
would you do if you didn't get any blood and any oxygen?
my doctor is a gerontologist, actually. And this year, when I took my annual physical, because I'm 71, she had me cross my arms and stand up
I was just going to
and
say
then
that.
walk to the wall and walk back. And she observed me and said, "You're doing fine." And what you told me was because my gait was relatively narrow and that I
Yes.
could get up
Sure.
without holding on.
Yeah.
So guess what? Every morning I do that now.
How many times?
You told me to do 9.
I told you to do at least 9.
Oh, okay. I didn't hear
If
that.
you,
I've been patting myself on the back ever since.
well, no, there's a woman called Deborah Rose at Riverside, University of California, Riverside, and she has a geriatric clinic, and she's done lots of research, and the test she developed, which I find extremely valuable, is to do exactly that, the standing up, without leaning. So you can start out by leaning all over the place. You soon learn how to stand up without leaning all over the shop. Her test is how many times can you stand up in 30 seconds from your chair? Okay. Would you like a demonstration?
Mm-hmm. Maybe we should all do it.
Be my guest. I'm watching you.
Okay.
Let's all do it.
Yes, let's all.
1, 2,
we're going to remain
3,
healthy.
4,
Oh, goodness.
5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. I used to do more.
Oh, wow. Okay.
You can feel
That
it in
was
your legs.
great.
Your legs are warm.
They're okay.
So it's how many you can do in 30 seconds. The average is 9.
Do we do it every day, Joan?
Yes.
Or
More.
how many times a day?
Well, that's the other thing. If you want to really do it well, anytime you think of it during the day. Now, the important thing that exercisers, experts forget. They tell you exercise. I give talks and I say, well, you exercise. They say, oh, yes. How many times you exercise? 3 times a week. Okay. How long? 30 minutes. I said, and then? And what about weekends? And they look at me. That's fine up to a point, but it's not enough. Because the system needs tuning. It needs tuning, and it gets tuned by the change in posture. The change in posture. Not to mention the legs in the process. That's a bonus. Yep.
So for those of us who are seated in this era of Zoom calls all day, is this something we do in between? So we have a Zoom call and then we stand up and sit down. Does that kind of what you're saying in terms of?
Yeah,
we
absolutely.
can also do this.
Oh,
we can also do this in between.
Yeah.
We can also,
right.
because, you can get bored from some of your Zoom calls, and this might help you refocus, right? So now we have, this is fantastic, because rarely do I get something from a Zoom call that I can really use in my life.
There you are.
And so this has been really great.
Just think of it like a violin that's being tuned, and you're the violin and you're being tuned. Go bing, bing, bing every time you change posture. Now, if you spread that throughout the day to at least 8 to 16 times a day, it's not that much.
It really
Okay.
is. It is.
It's not that much. But even once, but ideally, what you need to do is several times a day so that your system doesn't get used to it and forget.
Mm, mm.
And say, okay, you know, I can do this, I can do 20, and then forget it. Well, no, what about 2 o'clock in the afternoon? What about, 5 o'clock in the afternoon? Or change it. Don't do it just regularly the same time. Modify it so that you can sometimes do it. It's like high intensity exercise training, because when you do this standing up fast and repeatedly, it's exercise, high activity exercise training also at the same time, but it stimulates the inner ear as well as the rest of your body. So to me, it's the number one. People say, well, I can get all these pedals here you can put under your desk and you can cycle under the desk. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
And with this, we don't even need to purchase. We don't need to purchase anything. We just use, and I have, shall we say, a full posterior, and it really does work well with gravity, I have found. So this is fantastic. I have thoroughly enjoyed this, and we're getting comments that it's fantastic and it's
Thank
been
you,
a
Joni.
wonderful experience. And we are so grateful to this experience, and we'll probably post the book so that everyone will know about that. And later today, after I take my walk, because I do that for my mental health, I'm going to go take that self-assessment right after I send it to my daughters. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Back to Diane.
I really enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you so very much. I'm going to turn this over to Meg Sullivan, our founder, to close this session.
Well, I really want to give a huge thanks to Marsha and Dr. Joan for such a wonderful discussion. And I couldn't agree more with you, Marsha. I feel like we just all got this fabulous nugget to improve our lives in a way that we can all do so quickly and so simply. So that was extraordinary, Dr. Joan. So thank you for that. That's really an amazing. Amazing notion. Some of the things that I really loved that you talked about, at Quorum, we spent a lot of time thinking about how can we be the change? How do we be catalytic for change, particularly for women? But there's so many other topics where change needs to happen. And this notion of, we spend a lot of time standing up for others. And I just kind of love this notion of today of how about let's stand up for ourselves first and then stand up for others. There's something really beautiful about that. So that's what came to mind as we were doing all of those. And by the way, Dr. Joan, you did many more standing up than I did in that exercise. So I was horrified.
I was trying to show off.
I have to really work on it. So I'm horrified. Anyway, I've got work to do. I guess the big action that I'm going to throw out to the Quorum community is, how do we think about standing up for ourselves? So I just love that. So how do we get that into our every single day? We can do this. The second thing that came up that you talked a lot about was interrupting stress, understanding it and then interrupting it, and I loved that notion as well, instead of just living in the stress, do something to move yourself out of it, which is it's so simple. We all know this, but the hours and moments that we spend, particularly in today's world, which is
worrying,
just full of high stress at the moment, how do we get out of that? So I loved it. And besides standing up, hydrate. So I love that too. So I'm going to throw that back out at everyone because Dr. Joan talked about that too, which I just I just love. So those were so amazing and practical. So thank you for giving that to us, and I'll challenge all of us that we live up to that. I just wanted to mention a few things that are coming up at Quorum. We've got some amazing sessions happening in the month of December. We also have one coming up next week, which is for all new members for this year. Given that it's been such a funny year and we're doing everything virtually, we wanted to invite people to come and spend time together, get to know each other better. Since these hours go by very quickly, as we all know. New members are welcome. Current members who've been with us for a while are also welcome if you want to join that group discussion next week. So please do so. We're excited about that. And then we have a speaker on the 2nd of December. So mark your calendars. Her name is Najwa Atiga, and she's just an incredible woman doing amazing work leading in the Middle East. She is actually doing an enormous amount of work for advancing women in the Middle East. So she'll be talking to us about that, which is amazing. She's actually the GC of the Emirates Investment Authority, which is a mega player, as we all know, in the financial services space. So I think you will. She has an amazing story. You will really enjoy hearing from her. So please mark your calendar on December 2nd. And then we have a very fun lead up into the holiday season on December 15th with Deborah Robinson, who's going to talk about self-care, which I think is a great moment to talk about that. So first of all, we'll remind each other about the standing up and how well we're doing on that. We'll do a little check-in maybe, and then talk a little bit about self-care a little bit more broadly. So I think really excited about that. So I wanted to mention all those, mark your calendars. Members of Quorum will be getting together in smaller cohort groups coming up shortly, so you'll get invitations for that, and we look forward to getting together in little smaller groups, talk about how we can be more supportive for each other and available to each other. So we'll be working on that, and all of everybody that's in the US, I want to wish you a happy Thanksgiving if I don't get to see you before then. It's great to see all of you. And one last huge thank you to Dr. Joan and Marsha for such a wonderful, practical, tangible session. So filled with great stories and really amazing things we can do. So we feel so privileged. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of the